Hello everyone, I'm Jill Lofts, Global Head of Sustainable Finance at EY. It's a real pleasure and honour to be with you and our esteemed panellists today. It is now widely accepted that climate-related environmental risks pose significant challenges for the world economy and financial stability, with important implications for the financial sector itself. As international standard setters, regulators and supervisors set out new approaches to scenario analysis and risk assessment. What are their primary objectives and policy toolkits? What is the roadmap to global sustainability reporting standards? And given that climate change is a global issue, how can standard setters and other key groups, including the central banks and supervisors network for greening the financial system, best develop global solutions? The agenda is moving at a rapid pace, and I am honoured now to spend the next 50 minutes with you discussing some of these pressing issues with our truly excellent panel. Today I have the pleasure of being joined by Sarah Breeden, Executive Director at the Bank of England, Sue Lloyd, Vice Chair of IASB and the Chair of the IFRS Interpretations Committee, and Kevin Styro, Senior Advisor at the Federal Reserve. Sarah has oversight of the Bank of England's work enhancing the financial system's resilience to climate change and is also the bank's executive sponsor for work on climate change. Previously, Sarah was a director at the PRA's Financial Stability Strategy and Risk Directorate, focusing on developing the UK's macro-prudential policy, making framework and supporting the Financial Policy Committee. Sue joins us from the IASB, where she was appointed as Vice Chair in October 2016, having served as a board member since 2014. Prior to joining the board, Sue worked for the IASB as a Senior Technical Director, leading the development of new IFRS standards and as a Director of Capital Markets, with responsibility for the board's reform of accounting for financial instruments. And finally, we have Kevin, who is Senior Advisor at the Federal Reserve. Kevin leads the Fed's supervisory work related to the financial risks of climate change and chairs the Supervision Climate Committee, or SCC, a newly formed system-wide group that brings together senior staff across the Federal Reserve Board and the Reserve Banks. In addition to this, in February 2020, the Basel Committee established the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Risks, TFCR, to undertake work on climate-related financial risk, and Kevin acts as the co-chair of this task force. Thank you very much for joining us, and I hope we have a fantastic discussion on these truly important issues. Kevin, can we start with you, and maybe you could say a few opening words on the very recently published Basel Committee reports?
Good morning, and thanks very much for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to participate in this event. As you all know, the financial risks of climate change is a topic of considerable importance and growing focus within the financial sector, both among private sector and official sector participants. So today I'll focus on one particular contribution, these two analytical reports that were released by the TFCR last week. And these reports support the Basel Committee's ongoing work on climate-related financial risks. I think they serve as a strong analytical foundation for both the private and the official sector as we continue to develop our work in this topic. Just a little bit of background. Last year, the Basel Committee noted that climate change may result in physical and transition risks that could impact both individual financial institutions and the broader financial system. So the TFCR was created in February of 2020 to begin this work. And as Jill mentioned, I'm acting as co-chair with Frank Elderson from the ECB and chair of the NGFS. The TFCR work began with a stock take of what members were actually doing from a supervisory perspective. And then we turned to these two analytical reports, one on transmission channels and one on measurement methodologies. And I think they serve really as foundational documents for the Basel Committee's assessment of these risks. Both reports leverage extensive reviews of the existing literature, including publications by scientists, academics, central banks, supervisory authorities, and a number of productive discussions with large banks. And we also leveraged and tried to complement the work that was done in other international fora, such as the Financial Stability Board and the NGFS. Building off this analytical work, we will then investigate the extent to which climate-related financial risks can be addressed within the existing Basel framework. We'll begin to identify potential gaps and consider possible measures to address those gaps. But to be very clear, at this point, the TFCR does not have views on that gap analysis. So in terms of the analytical reports, the first focused on transmission channels and explored how climate risk drivers can lead to financial risks for supervised institutions. And these transmission channels can be both micro and macroeconomic in nature, and they arise from the two distinct climate risk drivers, physical and transition risks, that are now such a standard part of the lexicon. One conclusion is that these risk drivers can be mapped into traditional financial risk categories that are currently used by financial institutions and within the Basel framework. So this is the familiar list of risks such as credit, market, liquidity, and operational risk. But while this conceptual link is relatively clear, there are significant challenges that differentiate climate risk drivers in practice. And the report, for example, highlights how physical and transition risks will vary in important ways according to geography, across the level of economic and financial system development, and across individual banks' business models. And this type of heterogeneity is one example of the inherent challenges around understanding the ultimate impact. The report also describes how these risks can both be amplified by interactions among risks and feedback loops within the financial system, and also tempered by risk mitigating factors. Turning to the second report on measurement methodologies, the report provides a conceptual overview of the issues regarding measurement of these climate-related financial risks and surveys the main approaches being used by both banks and supervisors. One clear observation is that climate-related financial risks require forward-looking measurement methodologies and sufficiently granular data. These attributes are another example of the challenges that firms face incorporating these risks into their existing risk management frameworks. Based on this, on our outreach with the industry, the report also concludes that banks' efforts to assess these risks have so far focused on mapping near-term transition risks, and the work is at an earlier stage in capturing exposures to physical risks. So far, credit risk measurement has attracted the most attention, with lesser focus on market risk and a very limited focus on liquidity and operational risk. And finally, the report provides a high-level overview of the strengths and weaknesses of different types of measurement approaches. So I think these two analytical reports done by the TFCR will serve as a valuable foundation for our shared understanding of the financial risks of climate change. Discussions and collaboration with the financial industry were an important part of this process. We benefited enormously from a number of industry discussions as we did the research for the reports, and I look forward to continued engagement on these topics. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Kevin. We're going to get a few words from Sue and Sarah, and then definitely want to come back and pick your brains on your expertise on the two recently published reports. Sue, perhaps we can come to you next. Be great if you could just say a few intro words on the Sustainability Standards Boards and the work of the IASB.
Oh, Jill. Thank you very much, and thanks for having me here today talking about this important and exciting topic. So, as everybody knows, climate change and broader sustainability issues are urgent global challenges, and that's leading to heightened focus on companies reporting about these matters. Reporting on sustainability has become increasingly important in capital markets, and although there are already many good initiatives in this area, there's been an increased call from investors and others for more consistency and comparability in reporting about sustainability internationally. So what's the IFRS Foundation doing about these information needs? And before I talk about that, just a few sort of name clarifications. The IFRS Foundation is the overarching body that's responsible for our governance and oversight, and the International Accounting Standards Board, or the IASB, is the technical standard setting body within the IFRS Foundation. So firstly, looking at the traditional business of the IASB and the traditional financial statements. Because investors are increasingly interested in understanding the effect on companies' financial health of things like climate change and other sustainability factors, we've already published materials to remind companies that when you prepare your IFRS financial statements today, you already have to take into account these sustainability factors if they're material to your investors. So if you're an oil company reporting and you own oil-related assets, you need to be thinking about climate change when you think about impairment. If you're a bank lending money to customers who are exposed to climate risks, you need to be thinking about those risks when you measure expected credit losses. So this isn't news for financial statements, but we thought people needed a reminder. The board's also proposing changes to our management commentary practice statement. So management commentary is intended to provide information for investors about the risks and opportunities for the creation of future cash flows and the generation of value by companies. And we're proposing to update our management commentary document to ensure that when companies prepare their management commentary, they're being sufficiently long-term in their focus, and to remind them that information about things like climate change is important for investors and needs to be taken into consideration. So that's the work of the IASB. Turning now to the second main strand of work that's being undertaken by the IFRS Foundation in the context of broader sustainability reporting and the new Sustainability Standards Board. So late last year, the IFRS Foundation put out a consultation paper asking for feedback from our stakeholders about whether there's demand for global sustainability reporting standards, if there is, whether the IFRS Foundation should play a role, and what that role might be. And the consultation paper included the possible option of forming a new Sustainability Standards Board that would be essentially a sister body to the IASB within the IFRS governance structure. So the responses that we got to that consultation, nearly 600 letters, and it indicated broad support for a global sustainability standard and strong recognition that urgent steps needed to be taken and broad demand for the IFRS Foundation to take a leadership role. So given this demand, the Foundation has announced that it's actively working towards establishing a new Sustainability Standards Board. That's the end goal. And at the moment, work is continuing to ensure that the key requirements for success can be satisfied, including securing the funding that's needed. In terms of focus, the feedback that we received is that climate is the most urgent priority, but that other sustainability topics are also really important. So while climate-related reporting will be the initial focus of the Sustainability Standards Board, its mandate would extend to broader sustainability topics. In terms of focus, the focus is on providing information that's relevant for investors to understand the value of an enterprise in the short, medium, and long term. And while that's the focus, the Foundation very much sees this information as being interdependent with the information needs that are of interest to other broader stakeholder groups and for public policy purposes. So that's where we are at.
Perfect. Thank you, Sue. And again, we'll hear from Sarah, and we're going to come back to you with some interesting questions on that work. Sarah, would you like to say a few words? We started some of this in the UK with respect to scenario analysis and disclosures and reporting. Be really helpful if you could just say a few words around, what the UK has been up to and where you're at.
Thanks, Sue. And I'll try and be brief because I know you want to get on to discussions. The aim of our work at the Bank of England is to green finance, to transform risk management and to improve reporting with an aim of ensuring that every financial decision takes the risks and the opportunities from climate change into account. Now, that's a big ask, so I'll briefly cover a few of the things we've done that we can explore in discussion. Back in 2019, we established supervisory expectations for the banks and insurers that we regulate for them to manage climate-related financial risk. They cover governance, risk management, scenario analysis, disclosure, and they're designed to ensure that firms take a strategic, forward-looking approach embedded in their business as usual risk management, but one that's grounded in the long-term financial interests of the firm. And as part of that, we included the proposal for there to be a senior manager accountable for managing this risk. The second thing we've done, recognising that this is a shared and unprecedented challenge for which none of us have how to do it manuals, we established the Climate Financial Risk Forum, chaired by the regulators, but working with industry to build expertise and best practice. And our aim there is to ensure that no one has the excuse that they don't know what to do to manage this risk. Thirdly, because we need to consider these risks at the level of the system as well as at the level of the firm, and consistent with our objective to safeguard financial stability, we are undertaking a system-wide climate scenario exercise for the largest banks and insurers. That is a tough ask. We need to look ahead decades. We need to base it on granular data. We need to look at 3 scenarios because we don't know what is going to happen, but all of that is necessary if we are to shine a light on risks that are currently opaque. The fourth thing we've been doing is working with government and with other regulators on reporting and disclosure. That's key, obviously, because we can't manage or price or trade what we can't see. The good news is that the UK government announced its intention to make TCFD-aligned disclosures mandatory across the UK economy by 2025, with significant progress by 2023. The bad news is that's easier said than done, because climate change is a risk that we see looking forwards, not backwards. And so disclosure has to move from the static to the strategic, using the kinds of scenario analysis I described that we're going to do in our climate scenario exercise. And then finally, at the bank, we've been practicing what we preach, and we've applied TCFD to ourselves as a corporate, setting science-based emissions targets, and as a financial institution with our own balance sheet. That experience has highlighted that forward-looking metrics are hard to find, and that our balance sheet is not obviously consistent with a net zero outcome. And that is driving discussions about what we should do, which is a useful discussion to have, and indeed the point of disclosure. None of this has been easy, but the cold, hard climate physics reminds us that we need to make progress now, not wait for perfection later. So we're having a go and learning as we go. Back to you, Jill.
Perfect. Thank you, Sarah. And we will definitely come back to that. It'd be good to hear about your experiences on the disclosure and SBTI. But let's kick off with Kevin, if I can. Kevin, thank you for the summary around the 2 Basel Committee reports. It'd be good to get your insights on, maybe some of the implementation and other challenges that you think may have come to light as a result of this recent work.
So a few of the themes that came out of both of the reports, I think, are consistent with comments from other national authorities, other international groups. A few are around data is clearly an issue, and the need for more granular and different data than was previously used in analytical work for risk management purposes. The reports highlight the importance of that data in each step in the chain, from a changing climate through the economics and financial system to the risks that banks face. So Different data is required to assess these physical and transition risk drivers, for estimating the vulnerability of exposures, and for understanding the link from these drivers onto the financial risks for banks. A second challenge is around uncertainty, and each one of those steps in the chain is subject to massive uncertainty about the scenarios themselves, as Sarah just mentioned, about some of the measurement challenges for the exposures, and model uncertainty and the new models that we need to develop to try to estimate the potential impact. And a third challenge is just the complexity of all of this, understanding how all of these pieces fit together in a dynamic environment where firms are adjusting and consumers are adjusting, financial markets are adapting. And this is a case where the past is likely to be a less useful, a less informative guide about what's going to happen. And models that we've all grown to trust might be less valuable going forward. The challenge is still there nonetheless, and firms need to act and make decisions today. So that's, I think, some of the challenges that have come up and were identified through the two analytical reports.
And the audience can't see this, but I can see Sarah nodding in the background. I'm sure we'll come to you in a minute, Sarah, on the Bank of England experience. But before we do, Kevin, probably the last question you want me to ask you, having just published two very substantial reports, but I suspect it's very fresh and top of your mind. Where would you go? Where should you go next in terms of research opportunities and sort of really the focus of the industry and policymakers?
Yes, on the research front, both papers outline areas where there's probably an opportunity for the official sector, the private sector, for academics to develop our understanding a little bit more around exposure mapping and the development of these forward-looking assessments. So for exposure mapping, some of the topics that we identified was better risk classifications, so more granularity and recognition of the heterogeneity. So at a very high level, data around location is critical for physical risks, and granularity around the specific economic or financial activity is critical for transition risk. And that would have to feed into any risk classification systems. A second opportunity is to get the balance right, I think, between comparability across jurisdictions for some of the reasons that Sue mentioned in terms of investors being able to aggregate and compare. But this is always a challenge because you also need to recognize the differences in jurisdictions in terms of their financial structure, in terms of their legal structure. So that balance is a challenge. And then in terms of forward-looking risk assessments, this is really the core of the scenario design and modeling work that's underway in many jurisdictions. And those scenarios need to account for all of these challenges: the complexity, the uncertainty, the heterogeneity, and the differences in time horizon. Some of these climate-related financial risks might not materialize in the normal traditional risk management time horizon. Nonetheless, they're relevant for strategic purposes. And then finally, a point, just the operational challenge of all of this, thinking about the resources and the human capital and the training and the organization and the governance that needs to be put in place to do this in an efficient way. So I think those are some of the issues that the official sector and the private sector will continue to grapple with.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Kevin. Sarah, let's move to you. Now, clearly, Bank of England was, in many respects, first off the block in terms of exploratory scenario modelling, and I know it's early days, but I just wondered if you could share, some of what are you seeing so far in terms of early responses, learning, feedback from the exercise that you've started in the UK?
Like us, the firms are finding this a hard ask for many of the reasons that Kevin has just outlined. they need granular data to be able to participate in this exercise effectively. They need better models, they need to look decades ahead, and they need to think what is happening in three very different states of the world. One where we don't transition and the planet gets hotter, one where we do transition, but it's a disorderly one, and one kind of the Goldilocks path where there's an early and orderly transition. So this really is a big ask of firms, as it is a big ask for us as the central bank and supervisor leading it. But I think there's a recognition that it's better to start and have a go than it is to put it in the too difficult box. The aim of the exercise is to do three things. Firstly, to shine a light on risks that are currently opaque. Secondly, to identify where business models in the real economy and in the financial systems that support them need to change. And thirdly, to drive improvements in risk management. And that third one is really important because the most sophisticated institutions are using their participation in our exercise as an opportunity both to drive conversations with their clients and as a way of investing in their risk management infrastructure. They're rolling their sleeves up and having a go, Jill. And I think part of the reason that they're doing that is that they recognize what is a risk to their customer is an opportunity to help them solve it. And so increasingly, I think what starts as a risk-driven focus ends up being an opportunity to help drive the real economy on an orderly transition to net zero. And as I say, the smartest ones are using this as an opportunity to identify where that future business is.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sarah. And I guess, you know, it's an additional stimulus, isn't it? The regulatory supervisory stimulus to maybe consumer societal stimulus and perhaps firms' own voluntary commitments, of which we are seeing quite a lot more. So I guess in some respects, a pleasant consequence of the exploratory scenario modelling. Kevin, could I move over to you and maybe just ask what's next for TFCR? Where do you see this going in the future?
Yeah, that's a good question. And since the beginning, the TFCR pursued a gradual and sequential approach. First, the stock take, then analytical work, and then a discussion of potential policy implications. And I think that sequencing is really important. First, to do a positive perspective with a strong analytical foundation, and then turn to a normative set of questions about what might be appropriate in terms of the Basel framework. And that depends on the analytical work for its credibility, for its legitimacy. So looking forward, the committee will investigate how these climate-related financial risks are addressed within the existing Basel framework, then think about any potential gaps in the current framework, and then consider measures to address those. This gap analysis will be comprehensive in nature, spanning regulatory, supervisory, and disclosure dimensions. And in my view, climate change is too complex and too heterogeneous to pursue a narrow approach. So it's crucial to maintain this type of broad perspective and broad approach when considering potential responses. To be clear, as I mentioned earlier, we don't have a view on the potential policy response, the prudential treatment, supervisory practices, or disclosure. And our goal is really to maintain an open mind at this point and do the work and see where the analysis takes us. And that's the work that's underway now.
Perfect. Thank you, Kevin. That was really helpful. Sarah, I understand that there's a lot of work yet to be done on climate and sustainability risks. We do get asked, there is a sort of reasonable amount of consideration giving to would capital requirements become relevant here? And so I just wanted to ask you really briefly, do you think that this starts to become relevant at some point in time? Can you see circumstances where there might be a need to introduce capital requirements going forward?
So I'm clear that we're much too immature in our understanding of these issues at the moment for capital to be a part of the answer right now. Our understanding of what's going to happen in the transition, data, methodologies are just not there to support it. But we do remember that the regulatory regime has got three pillars, right? It's got kind of pillar one, capital, but we can also identify concentrations and vulnerable business models and use disclosure as a way of driving change. I guess kind of more fundamentally, I don't want to capitalize the system for risk for bad states of the world. What I want the financial system to do is manage the risk where that arises in the real economy. And obviously, in principle, we could use capital to do that. But it seems to me that's backseat driving. And the front seat is where government and climate policy sit. So I feel a little bit uncomfortable about that. Might we get there in the end with greater clarity about government policy where we're following rather than leading, and we're not to be accused of backseat driving? Maybe then, but I think we're some way away from that at the moment.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Sarah. Sue, maybe you've got the answers for Sarah and Kevin. So we've seen the recent announcements related to the standard convergence. You mentioned it in your opening speech. It would be helpful if you could give us an outline of, what do you think the requirements are of a sustainability standards board?
I think there's a few key things I took away from the feedback that we got in the consultation that are sort of front of mind for me when I think about sustainability. So maybe touching on those. The first is I think we got a very clear message not to sort of start with a blank sheet of paper, that we should build on the progress that has already been made, but use our international position to try and improve the consistency and comparability aspects of the international situation. So not reinventing the wheel. And consistent with that, the trustees have established a working group which includes representatives from the TCFD, the Value Reporting Foundation, the Climate Disclosures Board, the World Economic Forum, the IASB, and with IOSCO as the international securities regulators as observers, really to try to bring people to the table with relevant expertise and to work on a coordinated basis. And I think that's important. I think another key thing that we've heard loud and clear in the consultation, and I hear it every day, is this isn't the time to muck around. People want us to move quickly. They want us to sort of start with a running start. And that's one of the reasons why we have this working group. And it's working, one of its jobs is to work on a prototype climate reporting document using the work already done by TCFD, SASB and others, to sort of have something to offer the new Sustainability Standards Board as a potential first document, so it has a running start. So people like the governance and the security of the IFRS Foundation, but they said sometimes you're a bit slow and we don't want that part. So we're trying to address the speed aspect of things. I think the third thing that I would take away from how we're trying to think about the Sustainability Standards Board is that it's really important that we have connectivity and cooperation, so that the international work that we do is done in a way which links in with the work being done at a national or a regional level, and also where, even though we have an investor focus, we're working with those who are looking at reporting on sustainability with a different audience in mind, beyond an investor focus. So a key consideration for how the Sustainability Standards Board is sort of planned to operate would be to make sure that we've got good coordination with jurisdictional work and with others with multi-stakeholder focus. And we refer to that as a building block approach. And so that's key to the work that the Sustainability Standards Board is that we're looking at. Trying to come up with a sort of solid global baseline for global comparability, but where if particular jurisdictions or different stakeholder needs want to go further, they can do so, but they use our base as a starting point. So I think those are some of our key considerations.
Thank you. Sarah, you mentioned the Bank of England's climate disclosure report earlier. I'd like to just come back to you to sort of hear a living, breathing example of perhaps what that's been like, and perhaps you could share just some of the exercises that you and the Bank of England team have learned from going through that.
It's a great point, and it was a hugely valuable exercise to have done, both for the process of going through it and, as I said earlier, the discussions that we're having on the back of it. The first thing that I would observe as a financial institution trying to think about what are the climate risks that are on my balance sheet, what was pretty clear that was that the metrics to support those judgments were missing. Those that are there are the ones you don't want. They're the ones that tell you where a company is, not where a company is going. As we've mentioned a couple of times, climate is a forward-looking risk. Companies with the same carbon footprint today could have very different strategies for the future, one on a credible path to net zero and the other deliberately not on that path. And the metrics that there are available are not there to enable you to be able to make those judgments with the assurance that you would want. They're subject to some uncertainty. So we use those metrics, and they have driven really good discussions. The warming metric associated with the Bank of England's corporate bond portfolio suggests that the holdings we have are representative of the UK corporate bond market as a whole and are consistent with 3.5 degrees. That's not net zero. And so on the back of that, we have been having discussions about how can we take the climate impact of the corporates whose bonds we hold into account while still maintaining our monetary policy aims as we manage our balance sheet. We've got a change in remit from our government on the back of that for how we go about managing our balance sheet. And so what do I take from all that? One, getting the right information when you're a financial institution is hard because you want to look forwards, not describe where you are. That's tough. But the process of going through disclosure is good for you as the provider of information because it makes you look at the challenges that you have. So disclosure drives the right decisions in corporates as well as and financial institutions as well as for investors.
Thank you. And as you say, there's nothing like living it and breathing it yourself to really get that experience. Sue, so we've talked a lot today about increasing transparency, and disclosures and the increasing focus on measurement and management of sustainability risk and climate risk. Could you give us some perspectives on the IFRS's vision for the future in terms of transparency around these topics?
I think the key thing for the foundation, and it very much chimes with what Sarah was just saying about transparency, it's all about making sure that people have the information they need to make decisions. So the IFRS Foundation's mission is about providing the information that investors need to make economic decisions, and traditionally that's been based on the traditional financial statements. We now know that investors want information about other things as well, with a broader perspective, and as Sarah said, not just about what are you doing today in terms of your climate position, but what's your plan going forward? How might your business model change in different scenarios? And so that's what we're focusing on, the transparency to make sure investors have that information that they need. And that's part of the foundation's DNA, so it's sort of a natural extension of our business. We're not so much directly in thinking about the public policy aspects of it, but having said that, investors can be important agents of change. And also, if management's more aware of the risks, maybe that encourages certain types of behaviour. You know, you manage what you measure. And so there may be benefits, but the core focus is transparency for investors. Now, having said that, I think sometimes when we talk to people, they think, well, you know, you're meant to be about public interest, so don't you care about all of these other information needs and the public policy aspects? And of course we do. But as I said before, we think our role there is really working with others with this building block approach so that we facilitate the work of others while having an investor focus in the first instance. And so it's very much that sort of aspect of transparency.
Thank you. And you mentioned at the opening, you know, the work that you've been doing, both from a sort of SSB, IFRS, IASB. I'm going to get in as many acronyms as I possibly can in one sentence. But I just wanted to ask you if you could just lay out a little bit of a roadmap to sort of global sustainability reporting standards. You know, given where we are today, how do you see the roadmap playing out?
Okay, so the plan that we're working on is for standard setters, I think, very ambitious, but we are on track, recognising the urgency of the situation and working really hard. And the goal of the foundation is to be in a position to announce the establishment of the new SSB under the governance structure of the foundation ahead of the COP26 meeting in November. So that's our sort of end goal, if you like. And so what stands between us and that end goal? There's a couple of key things that need to happen. So looking at the sort of admin sort of side of things, first of all, at the moment in our constitution, there's no position for a sustainability standards board. Nobody thought of it when the constitution was put in place. So our first admin step is to go out proposing a change to the constitution with probably a 90-day comment period, and that document will go out late this month or early next month. And so my little advertising break first is, those of you interested in sustainability reporting, we'd love a comment letter, so look out for that. The other thing that we need to do is focus on some of the factors that were in the consultation document, which we described as key success factors. So that is making sure that there's enough support from key jurisdictions for this idea of the building block approach to sustainability reporting, where we utilise a sort of global baseline with the new Sustainability Standards Board to form a basis for global comparability and consistency. Do we have the key players on board? We need that confirmation of that. Looks good, but we need to finalise that work. And we need the appropriate funding. We said that as a condition, and so the trustees are working hard on that. So that's the sort of admin side of things. The other thing that we're doing is to try and address this point that people have made about timing and the fact that we don't have a lot of time at our disposal. And that's why we have this working group as well that's working on this prototype document. What could the first climate document produced by a new Sustainability Standards Board look like, and what sort of conceptual framework what might be used as a basis for the standard setting of this new board. And so in parallel with the work that the trustees are doing on the sort of admin funding support side for establishing the Sustainability Standards Board, this working group is up and running. I know I'm a member of that group, trying to work on the prototype so that if we do go live in November, it's a running start. It's not starting then debating what might be in the first climate document. We're really ready to get going. And as I said, also making it clear that everybody understands that this isn't just a climate standards board, it's a sustainability standards board. So first cab off the rank, climate, but other things to follow.
Thank you. We've only got a few minutes left, and with that, I'm going to ask each of you a sort of summing up question, if I may, which is, what would be your one big call to action for organisations and institutions who are attending the webinar today? And Sarah, maybe I'll go to you first, if I can.
Oh, why don't I get quite granular and specific for a change? I'd like everybody to make financial decisions with an assumption in there about the carbon price. We hear a lot about how carbon prices are the answer and we don't have one, so we can't therefore take climate change into account. What we do know is that there are going to be changes to climate policy that are consistent with getting us to net zero. So start making some assumptions about what the future profile of carbon prices might be. We don't know what they are. Neither do we know what the Bank of England's interest rate decisions are going to be. That doesn't mean we ignore them. So everybody, put a profile of carbon prices into your financial decisions starting today.
Brilliant. Thank you. Kevin, your one big ask, one big call to
Great. Well, thanks again for the opportunity to participate today. So as outlined in the two TFCR reports in this discussion, I think it's clear how challenging this is, and we all need to continue to build our understanding about how the world is changing, both the climate itself, but also the broader set of policy, technology, consumer, investor behaviors that are part of the response. So my one ask would be to continue to do the work, continue to deepen our understanding, continue to develop the data, the tools that are needed so that we can collectively determine what an appropriate path forward would be from a supervisory and regulatory perspective in the most robust and the most effective way that we can. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kevin. And Sue, last but by no means least.
I'm going to cheat and have two answers, one short term and one longer term in the spirit of, long term focus. So the short term one is look out for our constitution consultation and respond. If this is an area that interests you, it's not a done deal until we change the constitution. So if you like this, get involved. And then looking sort of forward, looking at this not just as a standard setter, but as a human being. You listen to this, there's so many unanswered questions about how you measure things, how you come up with scenarios, how you think about all of this. And also I think we need to be careful not to get into a situation where companies are so bogged down meeting different sort of reporting requirements that they forget that actually the big picture is managing the risks and working out what to do. And so I think if ever there was a time for people to work cooperatively, to share information and trying to move the needle forward, working together, it's that time now. Let's not all be working in silos, duplicating one another's efforts. Let's really try and find ways where we can use information, build on one another's information, and have a sort of complementary system of pieces that fit together to form a jigsaw that really works, to come up with good information for good decision making, because at the end of the day, that's really what it's all about.
Brilliant. Really excellent asks of our participants today. Thank you, guys. It just leaves me really now to thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you, panelists. A huge thank you for being so wonderful. It was a really interesting discussion that we had. So thank you very much for that. For those of you that are staying on, then please join us at the top of the hour for the next panel, which is the quest for better ESG data, moderated by Sherry Madeira, who is the Global Head of Industry and Government Affairs at Refinitiv. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye.